Good morning to everyone. We are in our second day of the French-Brazilian seminar on the history and philosophy of science. As we said yesterday, this is a part of the Semanas Franco-Uspianas. We have thus the support of the French consulate in São Paulo, of Alcani, of the CNRS Unity here in the campus, and of course of our Institute of Biosciences for all the infrastructure. I think also the organizers who are here, Jean-Baptiste Godevol, Laurent Loison, and Claude Olivier Doron, who is online and who will now give us a presentation, who is one of the organizers. And as we presented yesterday, we are trying to foster cooperations between USP and France, in particular the SPHERE laboratory where Jean-Baptiste, Laurent, and Olivier work. So I will not take much long in order for us to begin. We are excited to have this this third session on the notion of race, interdisciplinary approaches. And we will begin with Claude Olivier Doron, as I said, a member of SPHERE Laboratoire in Paris, with the talk Race and Genetics from the 30s to the 70s in the 20th century, beyond the narrative of an epistemological break. So, Olivier, I would just change the speaker here for us to hear you well. Test for the sound, Olivier.
Ok, vamos a tentar. Está funcionando assim?
Again, can you make a test for the sound?
Ok, c'est bon?
Oui, là c'est bon. So,
okay.
The floor is yours, Olivier.
Ok. Então, antes de tudo, quero agradecer a João e bom dia para todos. Sinto muito de não ter a possibilidade de ficar aqui com vocês em São Paulo e também quero pedir desculpas porque preciso ir embora muito rapidamente depois da minha apresentação, porque tenho cursos aqui na França. Então, vou falar em inglês. I'd like to start this presentation with a quote from one of Brazil's leading human population geneticists, Francisco Salzano. As some of you may know, Salzano initially trained at the Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul before coming to study genetics at USP in the early 50s. He took advantage of Dobzhansky's second stay in São Paulo to establish contacts with the United States and received a scholarship to work with James Niels in 1956, before returning to Brazil, where he co-founded a Sociedade Brasileira de Genética and created the genetics department at the Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul. He presented himself and is often presented as one of the founding fathers of human population genetics in Brazil, the man who made the transition from genetic program primarily focused on the study of fruit flies, following Dobzhansky's program, to human genetics, and more specifically, in this case, the study of indigenous population. We will see later that the story is actually more complex, but in any case, he is certainly not a marginal figure in the field, as he modestly summarized it in the document you have on, you see the tree, which is the genealogical tree of all the person he has formed and trained in the Brazil genetics from his days until today. So, in 2006, Salzano gave an interview which where he claimed the following things that you see here. I'm reading. O conceito biológico de raças humanas existe sim e não deve ser abandonado devido a exageros do politicamente correto. Raça é um conceito biológico claro, é um conceito clássico, neutro, não tem nada a ver com discriminação ou racismo. Mas, no afã de fazer com que o horror do racismo não exista mais, muitos geneticistas vieram com essa história de que não havia raças na espécie humana. É um absurdo. Lógico que existem raças na espécie humana. Me dá teu sangue que eu te digo agora com certeza se teus ancestrais vieram de Europa, África ou Ásia. No fundo, o problema não é a diferença biológica, é a discriminação social. So this quote is not isolated. Actually, we can find it as a rather consistent position in Sarzano that we can find, for instance, in an article of 1997 entitled Human Races, Myth, Invention or Reality. My intention is not here to discuss Sarzano's position per se, which raised numerous epistemological and political and historical problems, but rather to use them to illustrate a broader point. In truth, Sarzano is merely repeating here an old statement widely held in the 50s when he was trained, and notably by figures of population genetics such as Dobzhansky, Haldane, and Fisher. This statement is part of an even longer history dating back to the 20s, when genetics first took up the question of human races. This position highlights the durability of the concept of race in human population genetics through the period, contrary to a myth that I will present now, a myth which is widely spread in historiography and in common discourses, a myth which can take two different forms. The first one is the idea that after 1945 and the Nazi atrocities, the concept of race was abandoned in biology and anthropology, based in particular on the development of a new discipline, the population genetics, which replaced the concept of race with that of population. And this abandonment of the biological concept of race can be illustrated in the UNESCO's statement on the question of race. And we will see later that it is absolutely not the case, by the way. And the second version of the myth, a more refined one, which is strictly echoing the vocabulary of the proponents of the new modern synthesis themselves, according to which there had been a shift from a static typological conception of race, which had supposedly dominated physical anthropology until then, to a dynamic population-based conception promoted by population genetics. And this simplistic binary opposition does not stand up to historical scrutiny, even if it is true, but rather later in the late 60s and early 70s, that some transformation occurred that would lead to an emphasis on the dynamics and precariousness of the equilibriums affecting populations, and to the abandonment of certain uses, but not every uses, far from it, of the concept of race. So, to sum up, a double myth of a clear break, a paradigm shift that led to the rejection of the concept of race, which supposedly only recently came back with the development of genomics since 2000s. I will try to show you that historically, this myth must be challenged in favor of an approach that emphasizes continuities, shift in emphasis, and a more attentive approach to the complexity of the position at stake. In Brazil, this myth of a clear break that happened in the 1970s, 50s, is reinforced by two phenomena. The first is the fact that Brazil was taken as a racial laboratory by the social sciences in the 50s, which with surveys promoted by UNESCO, which highlight the social and political dimension of the racial question. And the second is the fact that the founding narratives of Brazilian population genetics all insist on the decisive role played by Dobzhansky and by the North American programs supported by the Rockefeller Foundations in the 40s and the 50s. These narratives go hand in hand with the idea which people such as Sarzano, Freire Maia, Frota Pessoa helped to spread in order to showcase their own contribution. So the idea that it was only thanks to their pioneering work that the field moved from flies to humans in the late 1950s, as if human population genetics had not existed in Brazil before then. And this position obscures a very different reality. Human population genetics program did exist in Brazil prior to the 50s, and there was a strong continuity between these programs and the interwar research on race and blood groups. And I will try briefly to illustrate this case by the example of Fritz Ottensuser, who worked at the Laboratorio Paulista di Biologia and the genetics laboratory of the USP Faculty of Medicine. So, first of all, let us briefly try to review how human races became a subject of genetic study. In 1918 and 1919, the Hirschfeld, who played a key role in identifying ABO groups as the main Mendelian factors in humans, applied the study of blood groups to racial anthropology for the first time. They believed they identified a gradient of A and B proportions, suggesting the existence of two original races, one carrying the A mutation from Europe, and the other carrying the B mutation from Asia. And you see the gradients on your right, you see, whose admixture, the admixture of these two races, had supposedly produced the current proportion of in existing populations. They proposed a racial index to evaluate this proportion, which was very successful in the interwar period. In 1921, Verser and Wegzensky showed that the blood group frequencies of Germans who had settled in Hungary 100 years earlier, and those living in Germany today were identical, and they showed also the same later with European gypsies and Indians, establishing the fact that blood groups can serve as stable markers of ancestry over a long period of time. From then, extensive campaigns were launched to collect statistics and publish data on blood groups in order to characterize population racially, identify the relative proportion of different racial groups, establish filiations and separations between them, and study admixtures and conversely phenomena of isolation. This quest was particularly marked in Germany, Russia, and in the newly created countries of Central Europe, in connection with national claims based on racial identity. We are in the 30s. But it also developed in imperial spaces in Italy, in Japan, in the US, etc. So you have some figures to give you the numbers of data accumulated during the period. In 1939, this research culminated with the first comprehensive study on the blood group distribution worldwide, proposed by the American William Boyd. And it should be noted that even if the United Kingdom, like France, was slow to embark on these studies, in the middle 30s, it established the Galton Laboratory, which will play a global role in post-war blood groups research. So I will not go into the details of all these researches, but I will only focus on a few points. The first is that it should be noted that while people knew that ABO followed simple Mendelian inheritance, they did not know precisely from the outset the genotypes to which they referred. And for instance, the Hirschfeld assumed the existence of a system of two mutations on two different loci. Finally, in the mid-20s, a model proposed by the mathematician Felix Bernstein emerged with a model of three alleles on a single locus, which allowed for a better integration of the group O and also a better integration in the emerging field of population genetics. A diagram then became very popular than you can see on your right. And I don't know if people are familiar to admixture studies, but it is a diagram which is still used in admixture studies, as you can see on the bottom of the right. This diagram is the Strang triangle, which allowed different populations to be located in an equilateral triangle according to their P, Q, and R frequencies, and which is, again, still used in admixture studies today. Bernstein also developed the first mathematical formula for calculating the contribution of two races in an unmixed population. So the first point to keep in mind here is that the study of blood groups was a privileged playground for the mathematization of genetics in humans at this period. The second point I want to emphasize, is that the studies of blood group distribution immediately raised all the key problems of population genetics, that is the respective effects of mutation, selection, genetic drift and migrations, as well as the question of the evolutionary scenarios that explained the divergent proportion of blood groups. A first question concerned the timing of the mutations that gave rise to the different groups. Some population, and especially the Native Americans, appeared to have proportion of group O approaching 95 and 100%. And one of the hypotheses initially put forward was that mutation A and B occurred after the isolation of these groups from the rest of mankind. To test this hypothesis, for example, William Boyd used the remains of Indian mummies to explore their blood groups, which is the first example of something that will be known later as paleogenetics. In the end, a consensus ultimately emerged on the idea that all humanity shared the main blood groups, that is ABO, MN, and rhesus, but in proportions that varied greatly depending to a number of parameters. So it made it possible to define relatively stable formulas typical of different races based on the frequency of these groups. And this, at the same time, did not prevent for the perpetual quest for rarer groups that would be specific to a particular group and would serve as strict racial markers. Concerning the parameters that caused the proportions to vary, the general consensus until the early 60s was that the selective and adaptive value of the main blood groups was negligible, and that hence they were primarily affected by two phenomena: genetic drift linked to isolation, and above all, migration and admixture. So this is why they were pictured as the best tool for racial analysis of population and for tracing their deep kinship. Races were therefore redefined genetically according to a definition proposed by William Boyd and Dobzhansky as, I quote, a population that differs significantly from other human populations in the frequency of one or more genes. Race is thus described as having a genetic basis. It is defined as a constellation of traits whose frequency varies significantly between populations and which remains relatively stable in so-called pure populations, the whole question being precisely to identify the purest, most preserved samples. So, after a period of debate, emerged a set of arguments widely shared to assert the clear superiority of blood groups to base scientific analysis of human races and to claim the superiority of genetics in characterizing race in opposition to traditional physical anthropology based on somatic indices. As the physician and geneticist Jacques Ruffier would still claim again in 1965, I quote, blood groups are the best way to perform a racial analysis as long as we do not have direct access to DNA sequence, which I quote, will be the ideal method of racial analysis. And of course, it is in 1965, okay? This position was widely shared by all proponents of population genetics, and although it emerged in the late 20s, it prevailed until the mid-60s. And among its defenders, I will mention Lawrence Snyder and William Boyd in particular, but it is important to keep in mind that the position was shared by Dobzhansky, Ronald Fisher, Haldane, Morant, and many others. And you have a quotation from Fisher, which is very clear from 1951. It is now known that differences between races are genetically determined, and these differences can therefore be profitably studied by geneticists. Race is obviously an important fact, and the word no longer has so misty a meaning that scientists should be afraid to use it. But what is very important to keep in mind is that not only genetics did not abandon the category of race, but it claimed to offer more effective, more scientific, and more objective tools for defining and identifying races, more effective than the traditional tools of physical anthropology in particular. So let us briefly examine the arguments of the two main proponents of this position. The first is Lawrence Snyder, who is the leading promoter of human genetics in the US, and who will become president of the American Society of Genetics and president of the University of Hawaii. And he presented these arguments in 1930. Blood groups, according to him, have characteristics that make them superior to other tools of physical anthropology for determining race for different reasons. The first one, they are strictly hereditary and they follow known Mendelian rules. Second, they remain stable under varying condition and environment. Third, they are not subject to conscious selections because they are not immediately visible. Fourth, they vary significantly between population. 5, they are constant across generation within a group in the absence of admixture. 6, changes produced in a population by racial mixing can be calculated precisely and mathematically. And these are also the arguments that William Boyd, who will publish the key textbook on the subject in 1950, will repeat over and over from 1930 to the mid-1960s. So let's see some of the argument of Boyd. Central first argument, blood groups are stable and they are transmitted continuously because they are closer to the DNA sequence and less affected by environmental conditions than other anthropological criteria such as pigmentation, skeletal structure, etc. This is why they are the best tool for racial analysis and to trace deep ancestry. Second, it is all the more true given the fact that, as I said, until the 60s, much emphasis was placed on the fact that they largely escaped natural selection and sexual selection. And this changed in the 60s when it began to be recognized that blood groups had also adaptive dimensions, were subjected to natural selections, particularly in relation to certain diseases such as sickle cell anemia or thalassemia, and were also determining different immune responses. And the 60s are also marked by a stronger emphasis on how allele frequencies are subject to random processes linked to internal population dynamics, in particular in small isolated groups. And this dual emphasis on dynamic factors will transform a little bit the picture, as we will see in the end. Third important argument, unlike the other markers of physical anthropology, which are determined by complex number of genes and obey poorly understood rules of heredity, blood groups obey simple and well-known rules. They can therefore be calculated and measured precisely in terms of their dynamics, diffusion, etc. And fourth, finally, Boyd in particular emphasized one point: blood group allow for a more objective and scientific definition of race, being invisible. They are not subject to prejudice and ideological manipulations. And of course, this point was strategically emphasized by proponents of a genetic definition of race after World War II. So let's see the picture after World War II. One thing which is very important to have in mind is what is happening after World War II, especially through the major campaigns against racism led by the UNESCO. In the historiography, you will see in many cases they claim that race is not a biological fact, but it is a myth. But the reality is totally different from that. So I won't enter in the details, but let's say that we can focus briefly on on the first and second statement of the UNESCO. The first declaration of race of the UNESCO date from July 1950, and it was largely the work of anthropologists and sociologists such as Juan Comas, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Ashley Montagu, Franklin Fraser, etc. However, this declaration was revised by geneticists such as Dahlberg, Dobzhansky, Dunn, Huxley, Muller, etc. And in fact, it was much more cautious than it is sometimes said. It reserved explicitly the concept of race for biology. It adopted the genetic definition of race we have just mentioned, and it clearly distinguished between race as, I quote, a biological fact and the myth of race as social prejudice. It deplored the fact that most people use the term race not at all in its scientific and biological sense, but to refer to, I quote, national, religious, and cultural communities. In short, this declaration is far from repudiating the scientific value of the concept of race. But despite of all this precaution, this statement aroused the anger of geneticists and biologists who claimed exclusive authority and competence when it came to race. This led to the second statement in 1951, which rather bluntly pointed out that the first statement, I quote, did not have the authority that only specialists in physical anthropology and human genetics could confer on it. End of quote. The new statement was signed by several leading figures in genetics and racial anthropology. And I will emphasize 3 points in this statement, and also that you can find in the strategy of the international organization at the period, in the varying audiovisual and press communication all over the world at the period. So the first dimension is the fact that race is presented as a biological fact. It has a very precise scientific value, particularly in genetics, and it must be reserved to scientists. And this is very clear that they want to insist on the distinction between a rigorous and valid scientific use of race and ideological and political misuses. As William Boyd said, I quote, "The concept of race is really not useful to the average person. It serves no purpose for them and is only useful to anthropologists and other scientists." And one of main Boyd criticism against traditional physical anthropology is precisely that its criteria mirror those of what he called the man of the street, the layman, who believes that races are differentiated by visible physical appearance. The aim, therefore, was to reserve the use of the concept of race for scientists alone, and at the same time to educate the common man, which is a very common strategy at the UNESCO at the period. So, on the other hand, it went hand in hand with the idea of criticizing the misuses, talking about German race, French race, Jewish race, that should not be confused with the right biological fact of race, that is the correct uses. For instance, I quote, "Most scientists agree to define most of the human species into three major groups, Mongoloid, Caucasoid, and Negroid, and then to identify different secondary races in this group." So you see, there is no abandonment of the scientific concept of race at all. And in this context, they promoted a distinction between race and ethnicity, which, it is funny, has been invented by one of the most racist authors ever, the French Vacher de la Pouge at the end of the 19th century. Third point, there is a very prudent, cautious effort to distinguish the assertion of the existence of biological race and the question of the superiority and inferiority of physical, intellectual, and moral capacities of races. The second statement of the UNESCO is very cautious on this point. It emphasizes the lack of consensus and the impossibility of clearly determining whether genetically different races imply or not inequalities of intelligence, for instance. And this is an issue that will continue until the 1980s, as well as, by the way, the question of the value of intermixing, right? Racial intermixing. For instance, just to give you an example, Sarzano, still in 1964, is not excluding the possibility that racial mixing can cause, I quote, a certain degeneration in the population. End of quote. So I hope that everything what I said made it very clear that we have not a situation where at the end of World War II or in the 50s, there has been a major shift on the issue of race supported by population genetics. The reality is totally different. And in fact, the post-war years were marked by the organization of large-scale blood group collections program, often supported by international organizations such as the WHO or the International Biological Program, and also linked to the fact that in many countries, the immediate post-war period was marked by the development of national transfusion system, which led to the accumulation of data on blood groups. To give you just the idea, in France, in 1939, there was only 6,000 data on blood groups. In 1964, there was 350,000 data on blood groups. So a huge difference. And among other things, these programs claim to identify the racial types of populations before the waves of migration and post-war migrations and modernization caused them to disappear, to describe the deep history and successive waves of migration in a territory, to examine certain interaction between blood factors and specific environment, and to study in greater details the dynamic processes at work in isolated communities. But rather to talk about these programs broadly, I want to focus a little bit on a specific case, which is a Brazilian case, and which is the case of Fritz Ottensauser. So, Ottensauser had a singular destiny. While he was undoubtedly one of the leading Brazilian researchers working in human population genetics in the 40s and the 50s, and was identified as such internationally, his work and his role were subsequently totally overshadowed by the narrative I mentioned earlier. It is important to insist on the fact that as early as in the 1930s, there were some researchers on blood group distributions in Brazil, especially led by the Seção de Hematologia of the Fiocruz, such researchers as Walter Osvaldo Cruz or Hernani Martins da Silva, initially in connection with projects on anemia in Brazil, and they wanted to develop, I quote, to levantar uma mapa hemática do Brasil. The idea is very clear, and Fritz Ottensauser became involved in this project, but he imported the methods and techniques he had learned in Germany. For if there is one place where human population genetics focusing on blood groups developed before the war, it is Germany. And Fritz Ottensauser was very familiar with this approach. Born into an important Jewish family in Hamburg, he worked for many years in physiopathology and immunology before specializing, like many of his German colleagues in the 1930s, in blood groups genetics. First to immigrate for obvious reason, he settled in Brazil in 1942, and his work illustrates perfectly what we can call the first school of human population genetics in São Paulo, which owes nothing to Dobzhansky or to the Americans, and much more to European seroanthropology. So just a few illustrations of his work. Sorry, I had forgotten this this slide, so I have to go to next one. So the work of Otten Sozer is a very good illustration of the seroanthropology of the 1950s and 60s and of their ambivalent relationship with physical anthropology. Because as I said, advocates of the genetic definition of human races wanted to distinguish themselves from more traditional physical anthropology. And they claimed, for instance, they could identify serological races based only on blood groups, which allow for a genetic characterization of race. And Otten Sozer illustrates everything we have discussed previously. I quote, a definição genética da raça é conjunto de frequências características de vários genes. E para identificar elas, importam os grupos sanguíneos, pois, em geral, sua determinação é fácil e seu mecanismo de hereditariedade simples. As frequências de diversos genes sanguíneos variam pouco por sobre continentes inteiros. Esta estabilidade permite traçar procedência, isolamento, mistura de populações por vários milênios. So as you see, we have here all the elements I mentioned previously, and they make blood groups the most reliable racial markers. But at the same time, we must note that on the other hand, to determine these races, seroanthropology actually relied heavily on physical anthropology, its category, and its methods. And you have some examples for the category. For instance, Otten Sozer is always using anthropological physical categories such as Negroid, Mongoloid, Nordicus, Brachycephalicus. And the same goes with the procedures to pick the samples, as he points out, for instance, em populações mistas, seleção racial rigorosa pelo aspecto, inquérito pessoal acerca da ascendência, ponderação do nome is necessary. So in reality, far from being opposed, physical anthropology and population genetics collaborated on the field. And as a matter of fact, Otten Sozer and the young geneticist of the USP, Pedro Saldanha, worked together with various teams of physical anthropologists to study populations such as Indian populations and groups from the Dutch colonies in Brazil. And what is the main topics of Otten Sozer's work? There are two dimensions of his work. The first is researches on the racial distribution of different blood factors through the world, proposing a general classification and evolutionary scenarios for the prehistory of human population. The second is, of course, the effect of admixture, what he calls racial misture. An admixture he presented, of course, as, I quote, intense in Brazil. And this is very famous. And here you have a citation of an article, joint article with Saldanha. A população brasileira presta-se especialmente para pesquisas raciais e de genética de populações, pois tendo-se originado de 3 troncos raciais bem distintos, recebeu, a partir da segunda metade do século passado, mais de 5 milhões de imigrantes vindos da Europa e do Japão. Sem dúvida, isso condicionará importantes modificações na estrutura genética e antropológica de nosso povo. And the fact is that Otten Sozer is internationally renowned for having published different methods for calculating the relative contribution of 2 or 3 races in an admixed population. And he's one of the founding fathers of what will be known later as the admixture studies with Glass and Lee. So to conclude, but Jean, how many times I have to conclude?
Ideally, 5 minutes to finish in order to have...
Perfect. So to conclude, I'd like to just focus on some transformations that did occur in the late 60s, early 70s, and especially insist on their limits. So what are their transformations that we find in the late 60s and early 70s? Then first, and undoubtedly the most important, is the fact that the biological issue of race became an increasingly secondary element in the much more central struggle against racism, now seen above all as a system of social prejudices, policies of discrimination, exclusion, and oppression, in which the question of biological races became secondary, except for peculiar debates such as the IQ controversy. Second, from the point of view of genetics itself, a new emphasis was placed on evolutionary processes that appeared to apply to blood groups, such as selection, and the various random mechanisms of genetic drift within population. And it led to a much stronger insistence on the unstable, temporary, and evanescent nature of racial groups, as stated, for instance, in the UNESCO Declaration on the Biological Aspect of Race question in 1964, I quote, "At any given time, the hereditary characteristic of human populations represent an unstable equilibrium. Human races are in the process of formation and dissolution," end of quote. And these phrases sum it perfectly all of things. In humans, it is believed that races are always a process, tending to transformation and tending to disappear. A process of racialization which ultimately will disappear with the disappearance of racial barriers due to mondialization and global migrations. This is the idea in the 70s, 80s. Third, this analysis reinforced the statements of those who have long argued for the abandonment or irrelevance of the concept of race in humans and claimed, such as, for instance, Frank Livingstone's in the 1962 against Dobzhansky, that, I quote, "there are no races, there are only clines." That is, that genetic variation in human population is continuous without clear boundaries differentiating different entities which could be called race. And as you probably know, in 1972, Richard Lewontin, in his article, The Apportionment of Human Biodiversity, will make a key argument, which is very central in this debate, arguing that the usual categories of race and ethnicity are of no interest for classification insofar as they account for only 8 to 10% of human genetic diversity, while nearly 90% of this diversity is to be found within population, between individuals in these populations. But I want to insist on the fact that, of course, these are important transformations, but they have very, very, very strong ambiguities. The first one is that you can, of course, say that humanity is 1998% identical in terms of its genome, or as Lewontin said, 25-90% of genetic variation is located inside populations, but it leaves millions of base pairs to show variations, a number of which are proportionally very unevenly distributed among so-called racial groups. And it is consequently entirely possible, and in truth, it is exactly what happened, that for political, economic, identitarian, public health, legal, and other reasons, people decide to focus on these millions of base pairs. And it must be noted, for instance, that while Lewontin believed that such categories as race and ethnicity were irrelevant from a classification viewpoint, this did not prevent him to admit that it was possible to selectively choose a particular set of variations whose proportions vary radically between populations for purposes other than scientific classifications. For instance, to identify ancestral groups, as he say, and use them as a marker of biogeographical ancestry, or for medical purposes, for instance, by associating a particular variation with an increased risk of a peculiar disease. And as you may know, this is precisely what happened from the late 90s. A new burgeoning field at the crossroads of scientific research and biotechnology, developed around admixture studies and forged the new concept of biogeographical ancestry, which is very similar, to say the least, to the ancient uses of race. The second point I want to emphasize is that talking about climate variation, climate distribution of variations, saying that races are dynamic and unstable entities is okay, but you can also insist at the same time on the structure of population, that is to try to identify patterns in the distribution of variations, clusters which are largely explained by the weight of the past and by what was then called the process of racial differentiations. So depending on what you want to highlight, you will insist either on the climate distribution of variation or on the structure in populations. And for, again, political and economical choice, identity strategies, from the late 2000s, this is the insistence on this structure and on this very small portion of 0.2% of human genome that there has been a lot of investigation invested by pseudo-racial categories. And it is important to emphasize the fact that the focus on genomic diversity has nothing to do here with the pseudo-technical advances in genomics, and more to social and political choices led to public health researches, led to various economic motivations, and led again to identity politics in various countries. So I'm concluding with that.
Thank you, Olivier. I don't know if you can hear, but people are clapping here. Well, thanks a lot for this. We hope that you can have you present here in Brazil at the next time. Such amount of information and reflection you have on our own history of genetics. And it's my cruel duty to open for 7 minutes of questions on this whole discussion. I don't know if Rogério and Diogo want to begin, have a comment, or otherwise we can open to everyone, of course. Okay. So who wants to begin? Well, I should say that there is so many things. I have so many questions. It's not easy to choose one in order to begin. But if I can, you are hearing, right, Olivier?
Yeah.
If I can, well, perhaps it's not the central point of your talk, but it's very interesting for us because we are in the Department of Genetics and Biological Evolution, who has an heritage of Dobzhansky and all this tradition. We have como fala placa?
Board.
A board in our wall saying Harry Miller was here with Rockefeller in order to foster you all. And you were saying, well, there is a first school of genetics. And just to understand you well, like you brought this as an illustration of another point. Do you think that the fact that the historiography is just to reinforce in order to know if I conclude well, do you think that the historiographical focus on Dobzhansky and Rockefeller and all of this accentuates the narrative of race finishing, and with the rescue of Fritz Ozenbuster, is this Buzer? Sorry. Ozensozer. In fact, with this history, you are also trying to show that race was there. Like, I mean, you are doing a parallel between a forgotten history and the moral of this history. Is this so?
Yes, exactly. The fact is that it is not to negate the role of Dobzhansky and the Americans' program of research, because they played a central part in the institutionalization in itself of population genetics. But they obscured a far more complex picture where you had a lot of researches on human populations genetics, which existed apart from the program of Dobzhansky, and especially with Ottensauser, but also, for instance, I mentioned the case of Saldana. Saldana is a very good example of that, because when you read the narratives of the different contributors of the history of human genetics in Brazil, they say, well, but Saldana worked a little bit on his own on human population genetics before the arrival of Dobzhansky. But actually, it was not only on his own, he was working with Ottensauser, and it was another place where there have been some works on human population genetics. And it is a way to insist on the fact that there was a lot of works on human population genetics in Brazil before the appearance of the so-called Dobzhansky school.
Of course. So, Joe is here.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I learned a lot. Very simple question was, how receptive do you find the human genetics community nowadays to the historiography that you're presenting? Are people making a connection, and what's the level of interest? Or are you usually speaking to other historians and philosophers?
No, I'm talking with various geneticists, and I will say that it depends on the generation. So I can give you two examples. There is some of them who are coming from the strategy and anti-racist strategy of the 1980s and 1990s, who will say, what you are saying is very dangerous. And I remember one of them saying exactly that. It's dangerous because it is so easier to live on some myths, such as the one through population genetics, there was a radical break, and we have exterminated the static and the typological concept of race, and now we can investigate diversity without any problems. Okay, so this is something which is common, especially with all geneticists in France. For more recent ones, they are more interested in the fact that it is a way to capture the prehistory of their own practice. For instance, the prehistory of admixture studies, which some of them know a little bit. So it's interesting for them to see, actually there is some continuities, and there are also some transformation, of course, in the course of this history. And then I will say that for many of them today, especially because I'm also working more on the use of genomics today, especially with the white supremacist movement, etc., as many in the United States are aware of some problematic use of genomics, it is useful for them to get back to their history to understand that there has something to do with the fact that there was not effectively a real radical break in the use of the concept of race.
Thank you, Olivier. So, as I said, unfortunately, we have already to thank you for your great talk.
Don't worry.
And so we really hope that in our next French USP week, you will be here present in order for us to have an occasion to exchange more. And then
again, I say just one thing. I'm sorry, I will have to leave approximately in 1 hour max because I have a class. So sorry for that.
No problem, but at least you have the time to hear Joe's exposition. That will be our next one. So let me finish